Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Looking West, Visionary Collectors of Indian Modernism, a discussion presented by MASH and Pundoles. Thank you for joining us today for what is sure to be a stimulating discussion. We are sure the discussion will raise some questions, and we hope to have a short Q&A at the end of the session. So you can type in your questions, and we will try and address them towards the end. I'm Shalini Pasi. I began collecting Indian art years ago, a journey that eventually led me to the idea of MASH, a digital platform. MASH explores the intersection of art, architecture, craft, design, fashion through in depth articles and interviews in an accessible and engaging format. Let me introduce our speakers today. Dr. Susan S. Bean has divided her career between museums and academia. As a long-serving senior curator of South Asian art and culture at the Peabody Essex Museum, prior to which she served on the faculty of Yale University. During her tenure at the Peabody Essex Museum, built its collection of South Asian regional and modernist art to become the first in the West to focus on Indian art from colonial times to present. At PEM, she was instrumental in acquiring the renowned Hurwitz collection of modern and contemporary Indian art and mounting a series of exhibitions on India's post-independence art, culminating in Midnight to Boom, Painting in India after Independence in 2013. Currently, Dr. Bean serves as the chair of Center for Art and Archaeology of American Institute of India Studies in Delhi and Gurgaon. Welcome, Susan. Our second speaker is Dr. Zehra Zumaboy, a UK-based art historian, writer, and curator, specializing in contemporary South Asian art. She was the Stephen Elena Hines Scholar at the Courtauld Institute of Art, London, where she completed her doctorate on contemporary Indian art and nationalism, and was an associate lecturer. She continued to lecture on Asian art and theory on undergraduate and postgraduate degree programs at various universities in the UK and South Asia. She guest curated an exhibition on Bombay's Progressive Artist Group at Asia Society Museum in New York 2018-2019. She has been a consultant on the Peabody Essex Museum rehang of its Hurwitz collection. Lovely to have you with us, Zehra. Our final speaker is Dadiba Pundole, who began his career as a gallerist in 1980. He is recognized in the field for his in-depth knowledge on Indian modernism, including Vasudev S. Gaitonde, Akbar Padamsee, H. S. Raza, Ram Kumar, M. F. Hussain, and F. N. Souza. Pundole Art Gallery began representing these artists in the 1960s. Dadiba was a consultant at Sotheby's for their modern Indian art sales from 2005 to 2010. In 2011, he began Pundoles, the auction house, which holds several auctions a year in various collecting categories, including modern, contemporary Indian art, classical Indian paintings and sculpture, decorative arts, and books. Why don't we begin with Susan? Given your Given your extensive experience in Western museum world, how do you think Western collectors, specifically US collectors, were drawn to Indian art? Tell us a little about the early collectors of Indian art based outside of India.
Thanks, Shalini. As you know, this is a question that has long interested me. Having worked with the Hurwitzes and their pioneering collection for so many years. And they and other Americans helped to introduce 20th century art from India to the US and Europe, much as Masanori Fukuoka has been doing in Japan. I think I can best respond to your question by exemplifying the earliest collectors in the 1950s and 60s after the end of the Second World War and after India gained its independence. They had in those first few decades a lot in common, and some of them had very lasting impacts on the rising transnational presence of living Indian artists. They were, if you will, proto-collectors. They came to Indian art from wide-ranging interests in contemporary India, its new political system, its economic challenges, and its place in the international order, and also its art. I'm going to share my screen with you now to, to India and to Indian art. At the time, in the 50s and 60s, as you all know, the Rockefeller brothers were among America's wealthiest and most powerful private citizens. Nelson and John D. III took a particular interest in India. Nelson Rockefeller served as governor of New York. He was also a candidate for president at one time, and founder of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He was also a pioneering collector of Latin American contemporary art and a firm believer in the power of cultural diplomacy. His brother, John D. III, founded Asia Society and had a lifelong commitment to collaborations between Asia and the United States and to building knowledge about Asia in America. John D's wife, the Blanchette, built a small collection, and of the actual Rockefellers, she was the one with the most interest in modernist art. The most important Rockefeller was not a family member, but an employee, Tom Keene, who was sent to India, where he lived for 7 years, working to support and initiate programs in economic and social development. As a footnote to his assignment, Nelson Rockefeller, who was the Rockefeller most committed to modernist art generally, asked Keene to find out what was going on in the art world. Nelson followed up with a letter to the American ambassador offering to help set up a museum of modern art in India, as he had done successfully in several Latin American countries. Keene took this art world assignment quite seriously and went about getting to know working artists. And in those days, before there were hardly any galleries except a pioneering place like Pundole's, this entailed going out to meet the artists. Keene, over several years, established close relationships with Hussein, Tayyib Mehta, Krishan Khanna, Satish Gujral, and got to know many others. And then in 1959, he organized a path-breaking exhibition in America that traveled an exhibition of 8 artists to 9 venues across the country in places where nobody had ever heard of modernist Indian art before. The exhibition was called Trends in Contemporary Painting from India, and the 8 artists, virtually all of whom have become big names, were Gaitonde, Hussein, Krishan Khanna, Ram Kumar, Akbar Padamsi, Raza, Mohan Samant, and Souza. In the process of this work, Keene made his own collection, and Nelson saw to it, along with his brother John D. III, that the Rockefeller family's philanthropic arm would support painters from India who, and over the course of a decade or so, they brought about a dozen artists to India to look around, to teach, to learn, to paint, and so on. These were opportunities for them to expand their international horizons. And in most cases, the trips had big impacts on their work and their thought and so on. But what's most interesting about the Rockefellers and the other Americans in these decades is that they were not first and foremost art collectors. For them, art was a piece of a larger agenda. At the time, the West remained in the thrall of the conviction that modern art was a Western phenomenon. Beyond London, Paris, and New York, there were only imitators. Not until the 1970s did a very few Americans take the then radical approach of collecting work by living artists as contemporary art. It's a long answer, I know, but it speaks loudly of the challenges that art from India has faced in the transnational world of modern and contemporary art, and has only in recent years been really moving past that place. It's sometimes very hard to get rid of those set ways of thinking.
Susan, I thought you were going to talk a little bit about the Hurwitzes as well.
I'm going to later on.
Okay, so you're waiting to do that.
Suzera, in the light of what Susan has said and given your recent experience with the Asia Society show, do you see a distinction between the responses and collecting patterns of American versus collectors elsewhere?
So what I'm going to do is actually, Shalini, I had prepared a little PowerPoint that was like a follow through of some of Susan's comments on the Rockefellers and the Asia Society show, keeping that in mind and how we sort of like put it together, but also ideas that sort of, that, you know, the Rockefellers as collectors and Thomas Keane sort of put into motion in India that we can actually see have having an influence then on the way in which the Masonry collection has been kind of constructed. So I'm going to very quickly do a screen share.
Yes,
Hopefully it will work. I think so. I think it's working, yes?
Yes.
All right, okay. And so this is a bit of the Asia Society exhibition, what it looked like, which Tan Bun Hui and I curated. It's called The Progressive Revolution. And I've changed the tagline, which was Modern Art for a New India, but I'm calling this small little nugget that I'm giving you, Collecting Modern Art for a New India. And I just want you to notice right in the middle where my cursor is, this is Blanchette Rockefeller and J.D. Rockefeller III, and they're talking to Nehru over there. So this is kind of why I put this picture in here. And then I just, well, like, it's a good follow through of Susan's actually. Excellent. In fact, all the little things that she talked about. So Tom Keane and his Hussein. So he's standing next to Hussein. And we've got a Hussein work behind that looks not dissimilar to something that Dadiba has got in the Glenborough auction. So next to Thomas, next on the right hand side over here, we've got Hussein's Yatra, and this is what we'd included in the show because part of the whole idea of this exhibition was also to engage with the Rockefeller patterns of collecting and to rewrite that dialogue that Susan so interestingly talked about of, you know, Indian art being, and Indian modernism being derivative of the West. And what Bunmi and I decided we were going to do is we were going to subvert that narrative by actually highlighting when the Rockefellers had actually owned a work of modern art, particularly if, you know, we were told that, you know, J.D. Rockefeller III and his wife were much, much more interested in antiquities, which in fact is what the Asia Society permanent collection is all about. You know, we would actually like do another narrative and go, oh, excuse me, actually, they were also really interested in Indian modernism. And let's look at some of those works and include them. And so one of the things that we did was that we included Yatra, which is now in the Kiran Nadar Museum. And we included it because it used to belong to Thomas Keane. The other thing we did was that we, in order to reverse this notion that modernism in India is totally derivative of the West, we said, okay, fine, but modernism is always contains within itself a sort of an answer to tradition in some ways. And if instead of having that old tired and tested narrative of, you know, Hussein is just like Picasso or Gaitonde is just like Mark Rothko, why don't we actually look at the Eastern and Asian kind of influences that went up to make their work. And the way we did it with like a double whammy was actually we used the Rockefeller collection of antiquities to create our dialogues. And so I'm very quickly also giving you a quick look at the work that Susan talked about as belonging to J.D. Rockefeller III. And this is actually known as the Rockefeller Raza, which we didn't manage to get for the show, but we had all the sort of images. And just to give you a close up there, that's Nehru meeting J.D. Rockefeller III and his wife Blanchette. And this is the Rockefeller Raza, or sort of village and church. And one of the interesting things here that I just wanted to point out before we move away is exactly that exhibition that Thomas Keane organizes. So there are two exhibitions, in fact. And if you see, I put dates in here. So I've actually lifted this from the timeline that I created for the Asia Society catalog. So 1956, you can see that J.D. Rockefeller III opens the Asia Society. And this is the same year that Thomas Keane curates 8 painters exhibition, and this opens in New Delhi. However, I also want you to look at the trends, the trends catalog, Trends in Contemporary Painting from India. And this, in fact, opens in America in 1959. And what we did was that we traced, right? So by 1959, there was this, there's this whole narrative going around that, oh, you know, J.D. Rockefeller III and his wife, they're only really interested in India when it's the past, and it's the deep past and in antiquities. But in fact, in 59, when this exhibition is curated by Thomas Keane, you can actually see from the catalog that the works were very often borrowed from the J.D. Rockefeller III and Blanchette's collection itself. So the Raza, you can also see there's something called Three Queens by Mohan Samant. And so this narrative that, you know, the Rockefellers weren't really interested in Indian modernism, not quite true. And that's part of what we were trying to prove. And also just to like give you a sort of setup thing and say that, you know, it's very interesting when we look at collectors today as to what their motivations are. But a lot of their motivations today are not political in this particular way. And something that is very clear with the Rockefellers is that, in fact, you know, the collecting agenda, the promotion of modern American art in India, which had such a huge influence, is part of a diplomatic agenda to get involved in India through some fashion, because you already had a big Chinese influence. And of course, you had, via that, you had a Russian influence, so, quite a Marxist influence. And so this was also the American CIA, which worked quite closely with J.D. Rockefeller. There are lots of documentation about that, getting in via culture. And the reason this is kind of important to us today is that I'm going to actually show that this kind of involvement creates a particular accent in the 60s and then in the 70s for abstraction, even within the this group of artists who we usually only intermittently kind of associate with abstraction. And that in fact, it is this strand that someone like Masanori, when he comes, sort of picks up on. And it's this sort of confluence. So this is something I'm going to go through very quickly before I come to my end slide. And I wanted to show you two things that we actually had in the exhibition. And one is on the left. You can see over here the Gaitonde, right? And this is a Gaitonde that we juxtaposed with the J.D. Rockefeller III's collection of antiquities, and that was called Bird on a Snow-Covered Plum Branch, and it's from Japan. Now, the argument being built here is that, in fact, so the Rockefellers started as part of this whole effort of cultural patronage, but also maybe say infiltration in a particular kind of way of an American aesthetic. And what they started doing was that they gave very influential and seminal travel grants to artists like Christian Khanna, who we will come back and mention. So Christian Khanna travels to New York in 1962, and he also by 1964, he and Gaitonde meet Mark Rothko. And what this does is sort of like, no, it sort of starts a conversation that is already underway with Gaitonde, and of an interest in Japanese painting and Japanese scroll painting, in the idea of this sort of East Asian ink wash, and also abstraction. And what they all find is Gaitonde particularly, who's often been castigated as the Indian Mark Rothko. In fact, the association is because they both Rothko and Gaitonde are incredibly interested in Zen Buddhism, and a particular kind of Japanese aesthetic, which they then absorb and bring together with, in particularly in Gaitonde's case, with principles of Vedanta as well. And so this is the kind of confluence, and we'll see in this collection that it's this sort of confluence that Masanori, when he collects, also notices. There's sort of the crossover with the Japanese aesthetic, with the Buddhist aesthetic. And my argument here is that it is actually part of the reason for this, and the move towards abstraction, which really needs to be studied more in the 60s and the 70s, is a formal one that has to do with American influence, and it has to do with the kind of Rockefeller grants that we're seeing. And the whole idea of a contemporary or modern Asian synchronicity that kind of comes out of this, and that you sort of see it with the Glenberry Art Museum, is actually the birth of that sort of nugget comes from this. And so here, I'm just going to end here so that Dadiba can take over from me, and just point out to you that in Dadiba's catalog, he actually talks about Masanori first having visited India in 1975, and that it was initially, he is really interested in India because of the Buddhist connections. And of course, he completely starts collecting in 1990 because he falls in love with Hussein's Cyclonic Silence, which, by the way, this image is actually in the Peabody Essex Museum, and it's part of a rehang by Dr. Siddhartha Shah, which we will see later in the year. And I just wanted to point out that there is a kind of resonance between the Cyclonic Silence that Masanori fell in love with and Theorem 13, which we can actually see also from the 70s, and one of the rare works of Hussein that is really sort of has a dialogue very obviously with abstraction. And so I'm going to leave this now for Dadiba to take forward.
So, and Dadiba, traditionally, when we talk about Indian art, Japanese collectors usually have an interest in Buddhist antiquities. How did Masanori come to be such an avid collector of modern Indian art?
Okay, to start off, good morning, Susan. Good afternoon, Zara, and good evening, Shalini.
Yeah.
Masanori's story is a very strange story from the others that we've heard, and probably might be more similar to what we'll hear about Hurwitz a little later, where he comes by accident in a way in 1975 to India. He was studying Buddhism at college, or just joined high school. He was studying Buddhism and decided he wanted to take a break and came to India. And it took him 15 long years and over 20 visits to walk into the National Gallery of Modern Art one day, which was in 1990. And he was really taken in by what he saw. Prior to that, he had collected South Asian art, or rather Southeast Asian art, purely as, to decorate his home. And after going to the NGMA, he asked a friend of his, who was his only real contact in India, okay, can we see any of these artists in galleries? So they walked into galleries, and they realized who sort of India considered as great modernists was still easily available in galleries and at prices which he couldn't believe. Because compared to Southeast Asia and the West, you could never buy an artist that was housed in a museum, walk into a gallery and just pick up what you wanted. And then he thought, okay, there's something wrong here. There's huge sort of potential, huge quality, and still not appreciated by Indians. And that's what got him started. So on his first visit, he started buying art for his home, and made subsequent visits probably every 8-9 months post that. And he just sort of mop up more than he needed. I mean, I must confess, as dealers at that stage, he was someone we looked forward to because he went by his own judgment and he didn't want to listen to advice. It took him a couple of years to start listening to people as he built sort of friendships, trust. He started going to artist studios, and I think it was a learning process for him. And what's interesting is that he turns philanthropic post-buying, because 2 years later, the common complaint he hears from all artists is that, there's very little known about Indian art in the West because there's very little published on it. So he takes on this job of publishing this book, which is the first kind of comprehensive book of contemporary Indian art at that time, which I think was around 93. But prior to that, he had already designated an area in his food processing factory to set up a museum so people could come and see what Indian art was all about. So there was a strong effort on his part to sort of engage the Japanese audience with Indian art. Sadly, he wasn't very successful. And he's built 2 subsequent museums to that, where he felt the space that he had first allocated was falling a little short as his collection grew. He built a standalone building adjoining his factory premises. And from that, he's now moved his museum to the first slide that we saw, the opening slide, which was when a small plot of land came available right next to his home. He acquired that and built a new building. And that's where now the Glenborough Museum is now housed. It's like hop, skip, and jump from his door to into the museum.
So thank you, Dadiba. Susan, thank you, Dadiba. Susan, as you were the senior curator of PEM at the exciting time when the Hurwitz made their first bequest, tell us about that time. How was the decision arrived at, given it was a time when Western museums were not necessarily collecting Indian art, except for the occasional Gaitonde at MoMA?
Yes, it was quite a wild ride. While I was listening to Zara and Dadiba, I tried to get the PowerPoint to work again, and that's where the problem is. It's my program. So I had a wonderful picture of the Hurwitzes that I wanted to share with you, but instead I'm going to have to describe it in words. It's a photograph that I thought spoke volumes about who they were as collectors. Published in the mid-1990s, in Fortune magazine, ahead of the 2 sales that they held at Sotheby's, sales that were the first major international sales of modern Indian painting, in truly international, and really opened the market, the international market for contemporary Indian art, which was what they called it in those days. It was contemporary Indian art. But anyway, they planned from the proceeds of those sales to set up a philanthropic trust as an instrument for their larger agenda of founding a museum for contemporary Indian art, which at that time they hoped would be in Bombay. The photograph in Fortune shows them in their fairly modest home in Worcester, Massachusetts. They're in their sitting room. The walls are completely filled with Indian paintings, modernist Indian paintings, including they had closed the drapes on the front windows and hung paintings over the draperies. Chester in this photograph is seated on the living room sofa, and it's completely covered with cushions and textiles, mostly from Western India, of mirror work embroidery. Chester himself was a designer of handbags and belts and other garment-related accessories. And so one of the accidents that brought him to India to begin with was the opportunity to look for materials for his own business. Standing near him in this photograph is Davida Hurwitz, Davy, who was dressed in some fantastic, heavy and gorgeous Western Indian silver jewelry, showing off, and she's posed with one arm on her hip, showing off these examples from her extensive collection of Indian jewelry. So they had tremendous interests in Indian visual arts. In contrast to the Rockefellers earlier, because the Hurwitz began collecting in the 1970s, the art was not primarily a tool for cultural diplomacy. For them, it was a new and really exciting aesthetic adventure. Their plans for a museum in India moved very slowly and then deflated in the 1990s after their sale, when Hussein began to be the target of radical Hindu nationalists. And at one point, I think it was 96, his apartment in Bombay was vandalized, and they began to worry that sending their collection back to India would not be a safe thing to do. On top of that, they were beginning to get some pushback from artists who didn't want the collection to come back to India. They wanted to make a presence for Indian art across the globe. By this time, and we're now talking about the late 90s, I'd known the Hurwitzes for several years, and it was they really who introduced me to contemporary art and artists during trips where we overlapped in India. In the course of things, we began to discuss plans for their collection. And I urged them to consider a prominent museum that would actively use the collection. And oh, wonderful, there it is.
Try. So people can now see this, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. That's your image.
Thank you very much. That's terrific. And anyway, so I suggested very strongly that they look for a museum where people who were not expecting to encounter modernist art from India would stumble across it and perhaps be enchanted, as they had been. Of course, I was fully hoping that I could bring it to the Peabody Essex Museum, which had been founded in the 18th century by American sea captains and supercargoes who were trading with India, traveling there and bringing things back with them. And the museum had its own rather nice representation of colonial era arts. I saw the possibility of creating actually the first collection in the West that focused on Indian art of the modern era, from colonial times to the present. Not the usual Western museum with a gallery of Indian art that shows court painting and temple sculpture. It took quite a few years for this to happen, but it did happen around 2000. And in the years since, the Peabody Essex has been able to significantly contribute to boosting the visibility in the United States and beyond of modern and contemporary art from India. So that's the short version of what was a long roller coaster ride.
Thank you, Susan. So do Western collectors differ in their outlook from Indian collectors in the choice of the artists?
Yes and no, and it's very hard to generalize anyway, but there is, of course, the big difference between Indian collectors and foreign collectors, is that they grow up if you're an Indian collector or if you were raised in India, you have a knowledge of the culture and the history that is ingrained in you from birth. And this is only acquired in a very different way by an outsider. So there is a different perspective. On the other hand, there is one of the things about the Hurwitz auctions in the 1990s that created a market is that those sales enabled collectors wherever they were, and most of them began to be, most of the serious collectors were and still are people of South Asian ancestry. And having an international commercial market gave them confidence in if they were going to spend a lot of money, they could feel that there was real value there, and they could, if they needed to, recoup the money. So I think that there were several factors, including the acts of collectors from wherever they were, that kind of narrowed the canon of modern Indian art, especially to artists in the progressive movement. And this is something that we're seeing begin to be corrected in recent years. And something like another person I could have talked about was Abby Weed Gray, who founded the Gray Art Gallery. Her collection is full of artists that are hardly known about now, some of whom are really very good. And there was a show at the Gray Art Gallery at New York University a couple of years ago of her collection. And it really started a conversation about the canon and about who are the artists that, because it was such a narrow field in terms of sales and also in terms of the number of scholars and critics who were publishing on it, who are the artists that were overlooked from the modern era. And that's something that's beginning to come to light now for everybody, not just Indian collectors, but for foreign collectors as well.
So, Dadiba, where would Masanori fit in with his choices? How were his collecting choices different from Indian collectors at the time?
I would say different, but he was very eclectic in his collecting habits initially. I think there were two purposes. One is he was discovering new art and artists, and he was sort of indulging in himself in it. And two is he wanted to expose it. You know, after 2 years, his kind of focus shifts on this museum and the book. And he also wants to expose it to Japanese artists Japanese audiences without a bias as to this is what I like. He was just hoping that the Japanese find what they like within it. Then, of course, as with most collecting habits, over a time, you try to sort of zero in on what your preferences are, your likes, what resonates with you. And in that sense, the collection has sort of got more focused, more distilled, more clearer. And now, of course, with space constraints in the smaller museum, he's come down to about 10, 15 artists that he kind of houses there. I mean, and you know, a very interesting point that Susan made about the Hurwitz auctions being sort of exposing Indian art to a much wider audience. And it just struck me, probably this auction might have the same effect, and I would hope so.
I think Susan's point about, us looking beyond the progressives, Susan, that is just so amazingly spot on. Dadiba and I were talking, we were looking at the catalog together and deciding what we wanted to speak a little bit about. And one sort of side point that we both sort of stumbled across was the fact that actually there were some really interesting people like Homi Patel, and others as well, who are so similar in terms of what they were doing to us, say a Gaitonde or whatever, but they just, what makes one artist stick, as it were, and become like a superstar, and another one who at the same time was doing more or less the same things. What goes into the myth creation? And you're so right that it's about time that we relook at it. In fact, something that Maud Chatterjee has been saying for a while, when he took me to see that Tata Institute of Fundamental Research collection for the progressive show, and he was like, "Why are you so obsessed with the progressives? Look at what other people were also doing." And he was right. And I think this is a conversation that we can open up. And I wondered, Dadiba, if you could sort of say a little bit, when you said Masonry is collecting pattern has now changed because the museum is smaller, but is it also that like he's now more concentrated on like work that he wants
Oh,
to
yeah,
have?
absolutely. It's purely what he now likes. As he says, now I have no responsibility to anybody. I have nothing to show to visitors. It's, let's say, you could talk. I very often accuse him of treating his museum as a personal indulgence rather than, serving a larger purpose in society. And he says, say what you like, so be it. It's a place I'm comfortable in it, and that's what I want to do. And I
Mm,
appreciate that. We always start off with these very grand plans, but
yeah.
finally you've got to realize that everything doesn't have to work the way you've planned it.
Mhm. Do you think it represents like a new kind of attitude to collecting also? Like all the people Susan has talked about and me as far as the Rockefellers went, had a kind, and you with the early Masonry had a kind of like an agenda, right? In terms of a
Sure.
larger agenda. And now private collectors, and maybe Shalini can answer this one, like, have they buy what they like, and of course their taste might change, but it's like it is basically it's a different kind of agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I study the artist and study the artworks, and I buy what I like and what I can. It's purely for my indulgence. It's not to make a statement. It's not. It's absolutely, whether it's design or whether it's art. They both are for my own. It's not to make a statement. It's not to. I mean, if people like what I'm collecting, that's a plus point. But it's nothing to do with anything external. It's my vision, and it's what I want to see every day. So it's very personal for me.
Nice. Zara, would you like to take us through some of the images that you've
Sorry,
liked in the
yeah,
auction?
now it's my turn to like get all
Yes.
flustered with the screen share because I spent so much time looking for that image. Oh, okay, here it is, sharing, and okay, get big. Here we are. So, Dadiba, you've got to help me out here. We were going to have this as a little discussion, and work our way through some of the works that like
Right.
um, we thought like went really well together, but also like things that really caught my eye. And then this Christian Khanna, we were going to discuss a little bit about the Sumi ink period. And I know Christian Khanna's my best friend Kajali Khanna, who is Christian Khanna's granddaughter, and she and I have been kind of really obsessed with this period of the 60s. And so it's just like it was just fortuitous that you mentioned speaking on this, because I thought that this is a good opportunity to grill you a little bit on this on the Sumi ink period. And but this is an oil on canvas, so how does that work?
So I think after he had explored sort of possibilities with Sumi ink on paper, the nice quality about, I mean, the quality he appreciated about it was the accidents it created. You were in control and yet not fully in control. And I
Yeah.
think any great modern work of art emerges out of accidents. But it's the artist who's able to recognize those accidents and then give them direction is what makes a successful painting. Now, what fascinates me about this work is uh, obviously the brush is a big brush that he uses, like
Yeah.
how you'd use a big Sumi brush, like load it.
Yeah.
You load a brush and apply it. And what I find most interesting about this painting is, yes, there is an element of a landscape to it, but not a literal landscape. He applies the black first, and then after that treats the canvas as his palette, where
Mm,
he works with white over it, with the blacks. So it's like erasion and addition. So the
mm,
grays and the whites emerge. There are just 2, 3 areas in the canvas where he's tried to retain the white of the canvas, though
mm,
that's got a little murky because it's obviously been quite frantic, frenzied working.
mm,
And in that, those few areas of canvas are still exposed. But by and large, it's a process of subtraction rather than addition, where he uses white as a subtraction.
mm.
And then you get these tones from black to gray to white. And that's what I find most fascinating about this work. It's
Yeah.
very gestural.
It is, and it's, I mean, like, this is a prime example of an artist that we usually so closely associate with figuration, and whether it's bandwalas or even the 70s general series, like, but the sort of 60s, uh his visit to Japan on the Rockefeller grounds, like, really changed his way of looking, and it's really fascinating. Are there more of? I mean,
I
are they?
don't believe he did too many like these. In a conversation with him, he mentioned he had done maybe about 5, 6 of such works, and that was it. I think
And
then he came back to
in
the
oil,
figure in oil, yes.
but they'd be more of the kind of the Sumi ink
On
ones.
paper, yes, certainly more. In
Okay.
fact, he exhibited works like these when he was in New York on the
Mhm.
Rockefeller Fund
Yeah,
scholarship. And he
yeah,
had a show there where he showed some of these works, but mainly those were a body of work on paper, and this comes just a little after that.
I see. This is really fascinating. I mean, like, if kind of an early, very very early Nasreen or Gaitonde had done it, like, you could almost sort of yeah. So it's like a whole body that kind of deserves to be re-looked at, I think. Where are we
I'm
going?
sure we need to relook artists, basically. That's something we really need to do, an in-depth look at them.
Yeah.
Your
Um,
second choice is the Gaitonde.
is a guide only just because of the conversation between the two, and because this is a grouping one doesn't usually have, and because you point out so beautifully, and you got a quote from him, I think, over here as well, that in
Mm.
1962 Christian Khanna received a traveling fellowship from J.D. Rockefeller III Council of Economics and Cultural Affairs, and as part of the scholarship he decided to travel to America via the East. And it was this part of this that he and Gaitonde actually meet Rothko. And so, yeah, I just wondered about the sort of 60s, 70s, and kind of what you can tell us about this Gaitonde. And because you did say that you would like to speak about the Gaitonde, because it's quite an unusual one.
Well, firstly, I mean, whatever catalog notes you're reading,
Yeah.
it's either Robin or Malika and nothing to do with me. So I think they
I
get
know.
credit for that. And Gaitonde really is
I
very
did
tough.
guess.
And Gaitonde is someone I find very hard to speak about. But
Yeah.
Gaitonde is, I think his art really emerges from a spirituality and not just a pure act of painting.
Mm,
Having known him through his life, I can't say that I can understand it when I view his work, but having understood the man and his life, I can
yeah.
certainly understand it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of control, or there's complete control, and yet the accidents happening because his process allowed for accidents. And
Mm,
that's what I think always sort of a painting from just something static transforms to something more, is when those accidents emerge. And one very interesting aspect of Gaitonde's work, and which is very clearly illustrated here, is
mm,
that the logic of a painting. When you see it, a painting tends to be bottom heavy.
mm,
Tends
mm.
everything kind of gravity pulls things down.
Yeah.
Look at most of Gaitonde's works, and he defies gravity, and yet it doesn't look out of place. And I
Mm,
think that's an amazing aspect of Gaitonde. And it's
mm,
so visibly sort of apparent here, which at first look, you don't even notice it. It just looks so perfectly balanced. But when you
mm,
think of it in logical terms of most paintings, it
mm,
defies that.
mm. I love the way it's sitting behind you also, and it looks completely
Well,
different.
that's
How on the wall,
intentional.
it's like, yeah, of yes, duh.
It's
But
not just casually come and sat there behind me.
but I love the way it looks. It looks nothing like this image that we've got over here. It's like it's glowing there
Probably.
behind you, probably. Yeah, and okay. So, where are we going
What's your
from
next
here?
choice?
What's my next choice? This, because it's
Oh, that's
women.
an interesting combination.
Yeah, and so this is where I'm like weirdly bringing in whether you think subconsciously or consciously, Masanori actually chose works that interacted with a kind of Japanese aesthetic. And the reason that I've chosen this Nalini, which I really wanted to talk about, other than the fact that I love this series of accordions, is it's called Cast Off, which I wanted to ask you a little bit about, was also the fact that it uh, Malika and Robin, now that you've come clean and said they've written all of it,
Absolutely.
talk about this as having been influenced by Nalini's looking at these sort of Japanese accordion books from her.
Well, Nalini made a very interesting comment about it. Her first trip out of India was to Japan as a little girl, as a 12-year-old.
I see.
And that's where she first encountered an accordion book. And she bought one and came back with it. I don't know what she did with it, but then the idea came to her of creating these accordion books, which has these sort of very Eastern aesthetics, and yet she can have a narrative and gives her the room to sort of play with, and she paints it on both sides. So the book can be actually viewed from both sides. And the title Cast Off is very interesting because she uses three references to the cast off. One is, of course, the caste system in India. Two is the cast off of a ship or a boat. And third is the industrial process of casting. And the references she makes in this book is, the first part is, of course, the downtrodden and the caste society and, things like that. Two is the migrant labor that were taken by the British to the West Indies, Mauritius, wherever. And so, the journey, the caste. And then where her studio was in Lohachal was a kind of it's a wholesale market in India. And she saw these very sophisticated objects, industrial objects, being sort of transported in the most sort of rudimentary way, either by handcart or, by people carrying it on their heads. And it's also a talk on them, that their lives haven't undergone the change that the Industrial Revolution has brought with it. They've still remained where they were. So it's several comments, on society, on the world we live in, and particularly, of course, Indian society more than anything else. I think I'd like you to tell me a little about the Arpita, because besides a stage
So
picture.
this one I was also going to ask you and make a little connect. So like, okay, this is me being a bit of a smart aleck. So cast off, you've given it three particular versions of how you could read it, but cast off, not that anybody would ever believe I know anything about this, but apparently it's a knitting term as well, where you cast off when you're knitting. And so this is something that I thought was quite interesting because, Nalini, as we can even see from the way this image is positioned, also did a lot to do with women and women politics and women's bodies. And this is sort of something that she shares with Arpita work. And they're not beautiful women, but the reason I brought up the idea of the fourth dimension of cast off and the whole reference to sort of textile and knitting is that, like, in the 70s and the 80s, you have a huge amount of women's art making that is kind of obsessed with the idea of using what was traditionally considered women's work to make fairly political statements about women's bodies. And so even if it's a subtle way of usage and kind of like comment that, things that are usually seen as domestic suddenly come into the art space in a way that you kind of rethink the woman's body. And I thought this was an interesting connection with the Arpita and the way in which sort of bodies are presented and represented, because in both Nalini's this work as well as the Arpita work, I mean, they're not beautiful. There's a kind of a textured quality to their shapes that is almost like a reference to textile with Arpita, but it's not. I mean, they're not conventional nudes or odalisques or desirable in that sense. And I did wonder about, what is this work about, the seashore, and like, who are these people?
That's a tough one to answer. I haven't figured that out. They're posing for a picture. That's quite clear.
Yeah.
And now when you talk of textile and all, I'm seeing this picture quite differently because it's right in front of me. And the actual forms are literally like appliques, almost like a collage or montage, objects placed within pigment, etc. But the figures still are a mystery, and the little boat behind with the water, the palm trees, the custard apple, these things remain little mysteries for me. But I think the subtle comments at several levels. I mean, the white sari and the black coated man, I don't know how you view that. And then
Yeah.
the nude figures almost like they're bare, they've got nothing to hide.
Yeah.
So I think it works on many levels. Hard to pinpoint exactly. I think Arpita would be the best equipped to answer that.
Yeah. And there's something like almost kind of childlike, quilt-like.
Sure, and almost the figures are sculpted with brush. That's an
That's
interesting part.
really I mean, I remember writing this piece about Arpita for like and and now I remember that it says that she was born in what is now I think I think it's now
Bangladesh,
Bangladesh.
yeah.
Yeah. And also that region, it was famous for its textiles and a particular
The
kind of textile.
kanta is what comes from there. That's
Yes.
right, which is embroidery basically. And you see elements of, that's why when you said the thing about textile, it sort of immediately resonated.
Hmm. Okay, so that's really come. Okay, yes. Now let's move on to this one, and I think this is our second last one. So to sort of bring the conversation back to abstraction in the 60s and the 70s, we were looking at these two works, and Dadima, do you want to say something about the Ram Kumar, because you call it a or Malika and Rob do call it a cuss work, and I just thought it was really quite a fascinating one. Before we get into the
this was one work where the title has really given me access to the picture. Because had it not been titled, I would have constantly been seeing it as most of his aerial landscapes of looking down at a wreckage. That's the way I would have been seeing it. But with him putting the title of Nest somehow made a direct connect with me. He was a man who sort of visited the hills and the mountains. And it's obviously, to me now, that's the way I see it, I could be completely wrong, is the nest of a bird of prey. And birds of prey tend to be usually large, they're very clumsy in their nest building, and they tend to pick up big objects also, which other birds will pick up finer and smaller things. They have a very rough, crude nest. And I can relate to it, and it's more a frontal view of looking at a distance in the front of a hill or a mountain, a bird's nest. And that's where I say the title has been most helpful to me.
That's really interesting. And, given what we were saying about how the 60s and, for some, even the early 70s, a lot of the artists we don't usually associate with abstraction were using it. And I think Padamsi is one of them. But also there was and of course, my argument today being that part of the reason is because of the influence of American abstraction, but also because of those conversations with sort of Japan and sort of Asia, and and the Rockefeller grants had a big impact on 60s use of abstraction, whether or not we acknowledge it. But another thing that I sort of noticed, when I was curating that show, was that there was the diagonal that came in by the late 60s and early 70s into a lot of these artists, even when they were not abstract artists. And when they were abstract artists, sometimes more so. And that diagonal often was floating in something that could look like a map. And I wondered if you actually had some thoughts about it, because of course in 71 you see the sort of second partition of the subcontinent, and you even have even somebody like Gaitonde who just does not do representational in any specific way, and yet there's a 71 work that you can really see the contours of a map there and things dividing. And maybe it's just my eye being kind of obsessed and looking to see divisions and diagonals when they aren't there. But I just wondered if you'd had a thought about that.
To be honest, I haven't given this ever. It's never crossed my mind, let's put it that way. But then I don't tend to look at things as in-depth as you guys do, as in trying to put historical context to most things when they could well be, but this I'm not aware of. But I thought your selection of these two works here is very interesting, because when we talk of the cusp, because Ram Kumar is moving from the figure to the abstracted landscape, and Akbar Padamsee is on the cusp of his metascape. Because if I divide this painting horizontally across exactly halfway, the top half is a metascape and the bottom half is a reference to still the 60s. So I find that as interesting as this, you selected these two, and I found it interesting from that perspective.
Yeah, less from the political 1971 and what's going on there.
I never viewed it that way.
Yeah, but can you talk a little bit more about the cusp for Padamsee? So and the metascapes. So the metascapes he starts properly after this period,
It's
right?
precisely, if I would say precisely 72, but it's debated. People have felt that it starts from kind of 1970 and kind of formulates itself more concrete by 72, because that's the time when he's also studying Sanskrit. And it's from Sanskrit philosophy and aesthetics that he derives the concept of the metascape. And so it's debatable as to pinpointing, but this is clearly, I see a cusp. It's for me, absolutely. Susan, would you have anything in this about the Padamsee?
Well, you're something a little bit more general. I think you just read my mind that there's an issue that I want to put out, which is that I think we need to be very careful in using the words abstract and figurative as categories of art, because they evolved in a Western setting. And I've always thought that they are clumsy because of that when transferred into the Indian setting. And Dadiba's comment that he just made about the background, the Sanskrit studies and the philosophical background of Padamsee's metascapes really brought that home for me in this discussion. Terms like that we tend to get overused, and the complexities of their significance are very tricky. So we also have to understand that what could be called abstract was something that was in Indian art for eons. In all the diagrammatic paintings that were made, and evidently something that could produce an abstract looking canvas was also there for Padamsee in Indic philosophy. So
yeah, I would agree with that. I maybe stretch it a bit further and say that the problem with those terms are not just because they're transposed terms, which I don't agree that transposing things is really such a big problem, because I think transposition happens both ways. But I think the problem is there, even if we're talking about, say, somebody like a Mark Rothko and saying that's abstract, because or Mondrian being a classic example. And this is because there is so much, there's so much back and forth. I mean, in terms of, what actually the boundary lines between what is abstract and what is figurative, they're just shorthands, and we shouldn't forget that they're shorthands. But just to say that, if there's, Indic philosophy in Akbar Padamsee, there's also Indic philosophy in Mark Rothko. And that's what's interesting.
I think it's a nice observation that's been made, and I think deserves an entirely debate on its own.
Yeah, which no doubt Susan and I will have time to have. But why don't we, this is a really, really interesting note in which to, I think, go to the next work. And Susan, thank you for that, because hopefully you'll come in here a little bit. And Dadiba wanted to talk about this as well. We've done lots of cusp works and transition works, but this is a work that, is sort of, maybe Dadiba, you can go into this a little bit about where this period fits into Swaminathan.
Well, the period fits, it's one of probably the last few works that he painted in his career, but it actually is a throwback of his work where it all begins. which is where he visits, I think, tribal Madhya Pradesh very early as a young man, and
Yeah.
then starts learning to paint with evening classes. And these were the motifs that he witnessed and that sort of played, textures, patterns, motifs, symbols. They're like clues. And how you read into it, I think you two scholars would be better equipped.
Well, you always say you don't know when actually you know more than us.
Not at all.
Thank you, Zara, and thank you, Dadibai, for your insight into these amazing works. The next question is for Susan and Zahra. How strongly have you both, as curators, been influenced by collectors and their choices? Do you think these early collectors became tastemakers in their own right and influenced what future generations of collectors choose for their own collection? Or does great art speak for itself?
First, I'll say that I don't think art ever speaks for itself. We speak for it, and that we've seen on display as some of the works that will be coming into the sale are discussed to try to understand what they mean and how to interpret them. And we all know that over time, tastes change and fashions change. So that said, I would say that collectors have had a huge impact on the field. The biggest impact that I have seen, the sort of meta impact from a curator and scholar's point of view, is that until the Indian art market got really lively in the late 1990s, after liberalization, and before the crash in the early 2000s, during that period. And collectors were active, and auctions were active, and biennials were happening, and people were going. And at that point, I watched as my friends teaching in universities where Indian art ended in maybe 1830. And after that, there was this hybrid colonial stuff that wasn't really Indian, and then nothing. And it took the rise of the art market, I believe, to demand that scholars take the colonial period and the modern period afterwards, the post-independence period, to take those eras seriously and to take the art seriously that came from them. So that's the meta picture. In a more down-to-earth way, as someone who came into the field in the 1990s, I did so with the Hurwitzes holding my hand and dragging me along. I had been doing work in India with other visual arts and in other areas since the 1970s. But this was really my, being thrown into the deep end of the pool in the field of contemporary Indian art, as it was then known in the 20th century. So yes, they were very influential on me. And I found once we had the Hurwitz collection at the Peabody Essex Museum, there were other very nuts and bolts factors that made their collection, once it was in a museum, have a huge impact on the field. And that was that when a curator or a scholar wanted easy access, informal access to a collection, they came to the Peabody Essex Museum. Otherwise, if you wanted to see a lot of Hussein paintings, you had to know somebody who was a private collector and get access that way. You couldn't just ring up an institution and say, I want to come and look at your paintings, and I want to look at the information that you have about them. That's something that a museum can offer. And of course, since the museums, especially nowadays, get their works from collectors, the connections are intimate between collecting what museums do, what they have as available for curators, and scholarship. They're very intimately connected.
May I interject here for a minute?
Sure.
Susan, you spoke about how the Peabody Essex gave access to so many people, and that's exactly what happened with the Glenborough Museum in Japan. Even though he may not have had visitors, he had several other museums who knew now that there was a pool that they could borrow from.
Yes.
There were several, exhibitions that he did all over Japan, which were lent from his collection. So it's very, very similar in that sense.
Yeah.
I wondered, Susan, if you think that sort of how to put this, if you think that in some ways the market agenda might be driving as well what goes into public institutions.
Sure. I mean, I have long thought, and your show, Zara, the progressive show at Asia Society, disabused me a little bit from this point of view, but I have long thought that the progressives as a movement was in some big percentage a marketing strategy that was arrived at to boost a certain group of painters. And that's one of the things that narrowed the canon in the way we've been talking about it. And another thing that made them, the progressives, the so-called progressives, the standard bearers after the market crash in the early 2000s. It was, as far as I know, and Daliba, you can comment on this, the part of the modern and contemporary market that remained kind of stable and didn't suffer a huge decline. So I think that the market is very powerful in this, as it is in all art. Art was being commodified, centuries ago. It turned into a commodity, an important commodity. And that's had a huge impact on how it's viewed, even by curators and scholars.
Yeah, but the PAG artists, you've got to give them due for one fact, and I think Sousa was the most instrumental for it, that they were confident of what they did and they were happy to sort of speak about it, whilst other artists did lack that sense of belief or confidence. They believed in what they were doing. There was a genuine sense of belief. They were slightly ignorant, maybe, they were still groping, but the belief was, you can't question the belief. And I think that's what translated onto an audience.
Right, I think that's true. And Hussein is a terrific example of that, because I was, as we were all talking the other day, and as I've been working on this, I noticed what a huge presence he was in the rise of the visibility of Indian modernism. And a lot of that came out of his confidence in what he was doing and his willingness to put it out there and be proactive with all kinds of potential collectors and so on, and opportunities.
Sure.
I wonder though, just to probe and be a bit irritating, and you can just tell me to shut up if it's not something that you want to be probed on, but whether in some sense, okay, so, the progressives have always had a different kind of market to the contemporary. Like the contemporary used to be, before the crash, much, much more collected by an international audience that didn't necessarily need to be Indian. Whereas the progressives were very much, what like in the sort of cutting edge bits of the art world, we would call sort of nostalgia buyers in some sense. I think that has sort of also changed a little bit after the crash, in the kind, not just everything that happens to have a progressive title will sell, but I wonder whether, you know, contemporary art coming back into the fray is actually, it's also sort of being doctored by certain dealers who have connects within the museum world, and whether this is something that actually we should just be fine with and be quite happy with, or something that, you know, in your experience, we should be a little bit cautious about celebrating it, and how.
Are
So,
you asking Jaiba or me?
So we have a
You, Susan, because, like, you know,
Okay.
it's your world in a way, the museum world.
Shalini is trying to say something though.
Yeah, so we have a question from, and it's to all panelists. Indian art has had a fascinating abstraction for eons. So, is there anyone in historical Indian painting that could hint at being a precursor to the progressive movement? This is for all the panelists.
I think the scholars could take that.
I wouldn't know how to answer it. Like, what does it mean? Historical Indian painting could hint at being a precursor to
Indian art. Should I repeat the question?
Yeah, sure.
Indian art had fascinating abstractions for eons. So, is there anyone in historical Indian painting that could hint at being the precursor of the progressive movement?
Maybe it means that the diagrammatic mandala paintings and so on. What I would like to say about that is that one of the things that we need to look at more seriously in art historical studies and in curation as well is the connects. When I look at India, I see art worlds, little swirls of art worlds all over the place. And they have interacted with one another at the same time and over history. And we all know many artists. Dadiba was speaking of Swaminathan and his visit to Gond village and seeing things there that later were expressed in his art. We know that's been an experience for so many artists, not just historical abstract Indian art, but historical figurative art. Look at Hussein going to visit temples and then having the figures there work their way into his painting. So there's a lot to be still learned and focused on about the ways in which Indian artists have seriously encountered and drawn on not just the ancient, but the contemporary other kinds of art in India, the textiles that show up as having an impact in the Arpita work that you showed. She was, I believe, for some time working in one of those artisan weaving centers, helping to design. So, you know, these experiences have really fed and enriched Indian artists. And it's one of the things that makes them distinctive in the world of modernism and contemporary art.
Yeah, I think the 40s and the 50s, a lot of damage was done by the art schools, which was trying to train artists and took them sort of a little off course, but it sort of brought itself back on course, I think, pretty quickly. And that is where I think the progressive artist group becomes more significant, because at a time when everyone was being swayed by Western academic painting, this was a group of artists sort of defying that.
And you were quite vocal about the fact that, you know, they were modern, but they were also drawing on, you know, sources that were kind of very plural, but very Indian. And they were, you know, from tribal to fine art to sculpture and all kinds of things. And so that's really interesting.
Any other nice questions?
Not. Yeah, please do send us your questions. We'll be the panelists will be happy to answer them.
Lots of questions, but I don't really. No, they're not questions, they're comments.
But I have a question for Shalini. Shalini, if you had to make a statement at your home which reflects you, immaterial of what's in this exhibition, what is the one work you'd hang on your wall? If not, okay, or work or works, what would you do?
So the work has to speak to me, and I think Nasreen Mohammadi's double-sided drawing from 1980s for his
Mm-hmm.
spectacular geometry and the
Mm-hmm.
sense of perception, which is so unique to her. I mean, I'm absolutely like can't stop looking at the work and the perfect lines and the perspective. And her approach makes her work personal to each viewer. And also, my favorite is Somnath's bronze sculpture, that is the goat sculpture. The sculpture is simple, yet you can see his entire, lifelong practice on humanism. And of course, Ramkumar's nest is my absolute, like, I mean, I used to paint and I always looked up
Oh,
to the way and I also use the knife. So for me, I think that work is just incredible. And of course,
super.
Tayyab's Head of the Bull, which is a fantastic work because it's so powerful. So these
Lovely.
are
May
two
I
of my
may I
favorite.
put 4 little red dots now?
Yeah, sure.
No? Thank you, Shalini.
Thank
That's
you.
been wonderful.
Yeah, but Dadiba, you didn't quite ask the question in the naughty way in which you said you were going to ask it.
No, I didn't. I changed my mind.
We have a few questions
Okay.
from Ms. Gehi. Who determines the star artist? The names of a period? Is it the market, media, or collectors? Are we over romanticizing the PAG? Who were the other moderns who were being rediscovered now? It's a great question from Rima.
Well, I think all these factors play a role. It starts from the dealer, it goes to the media, it then moves on to the collector, and then to the institutions which then start displaying it. So it's several factors that have to come together at the right time, at the right place, or it just doesn't work, sadly. And which is why you recognize a lot of artists later on in their careers, like a Homi Patel, as was mentioned earlier, who through his career he got a little bit of success early on, but then was forgotten. But today people are comparing him with some of the best modern Indian painters. So this is something that I think it plays itself out in every aspect of life, not just art.
So Dadiba, there's a question for you from Mr. Bhagat. How about collection of artworks from South India? Any artists from southern region who will be in the auction?
Well, they are, not will be, they are. There is a very early Vishwanathan that we have in this show, which is before he goes to Paris. We've got several works by Lakshma Gaud, very fine drawings. South Indian artists, who else do we have? We have a Redappa Naidu, which is a painting with a little bit of collage in it, which was very similar. Now, when you see Vishwanathan and you see the Redappa Naidu, you do see a sort of connect with Chola Mandala and something that we are talking, going back to Indian traditions, and which was something that KCS Panikkar very strongly tried to instill in Chola Mandal when he set it up. The sad part about it was that he tried to make the artists very similar to the art schools, proficient at something that they could produce for the market. And I think that was the only sort of downside to it, because the belief was not there that you could sustain yourself purely as a painter or just as an artist. So you see elements of it in their work. It draws an Indian sort of folk and tribal motifs, but at the same time brings in another element which can do a little bit of damage. Then I think another great work from South India is the Achyutan Kudallur, a large canvas of his, and again the same term of abstractionist, but here we've got someone who in this painting he uses sort of, again, very similar to Swami in a way in terms of choice of motive and selection of forms. So I think we've got a fair bit of South Indian representation here.
So the next question is, what has to happen to shift the progressive from the dominance at the top end of the auctions?
That's for the other two, not me.
No, I think it's for you, Dadiba.
I think it suits me this way, so I'm not answering that. You guys go ahead.
You are the auction, so.
So it suits me, so I'm not disturbing that. You all go ahead, please do.
Well, maybe we just need more discussions. which is my nice little plug for something we're trying to persuade Susan to be part of, which is Siddharth Shah at Peabody Essex, Jahangir Nicholson Collection Director, Pooja Vaish, and I have got a talk series that we're doing, and we're debating exactly this kind of question. So yeah, and hopefully Susan will help us.
I think there's lots that can be said here, lots. And there's a lot that is there. We all know it. It's not that we don't.
Yeah. And I think it's naturally broadening anyway. You know, with the coming of what is now called contemporary art and the huge changes in the visibility and accessibility of work by Indian artists across the world, where almost every country is showing in ways that they were unseen 20 years ago. And this is bringing out more kinds of art and more artists, and I think that the breadth of who we look at and how they're valued will change over time.
I mean, like even the example of C.M. Mohan Samant, that you know, when I started research for the show, you know, we were like, what is the list of the actual progressives? And everybody was like, oh no, not Mohan. No, Mohan Samant was Bombay art. You know, he wasn't part of it. And then actually, like, you can trace it. Yes, he was, and he always said he was, and there's no reason to exclude him. And then the second he gets included in it, everybody is like, oh, now he's a progressive artist, and we can put him in an auction. And there's suddenly a market for him. So I think it's also like, you know, maybe people taking some risks, and pushing the narrative a little bit, and yeah, it's just a risk.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, Dadiba, would you or one of you stick your neck out and call out from today's world would be the works for nostalgia buyers, as in, is there something like progressive movement going on even today?
I think the progressive artist group that formed was relevant to its time. But there will be similar movements that will keep happening right through. But to refer it to the progressive artist group would be very unfair because that only happened at that moment in time. But one thing that I've noticed about the progressive artist group was all of them and the ones on the periphery, maybe it be a Tayyab Mehta or Ram Kumar, who were never really part of the group, interacted very closely with each other. And they were in each other's studios virtually all the time. And yet you see each artist independently, distinctly different from the other. And yet sharing ideas, sharing their beliefs, openly sharing. I don't see that happening today. You know, today it's a lot more sort of protected. You know, this is what I'm doing. I don't want my idea to be stolen by somebody else before I've, you know, exhibited it. So I'm sure that even happened then, but nobody really cared about it. You had your...
It wasn't a market. So like in a way...
It wasn't a market. Each one had their own belief. What made them painters? Where was the money in it? So why were they painting? They painted purely out of belief, and that was the only thing they wanted to do. So there was no question about it.
Yeah. So is Professor Walter Langhammer still remembered for his contribution to modern Indian art? Was he ever considered a collector of ancient India and Hindu artifacts? Thank you. Oh, sorry, it's a part of...
This is a Dadiba question, unless Susan can handle it.
Well, I'm sure all of them, I mean, when we talk of the three Europeans in India at that time, it was Langhammer, Leiden, and Schlesinger. Schlesinger definitely collected Indian antiquities, and extensively, along with modern Indian art. In fact, when his ship broke down in Bombay on his way to Hong Kong to migrate to Australia, they needed parts. So the ship was here for a few months, and he took the first opportunity to go and see Ajanta and Ellora. So his interest in art was quite eclectic. It wasn't just the modern art. It was then that he encouraged the modernists by being a patron. And Langhammer was a teacher, basically. So he had a strong influence on people like Raza, for say. Raza was very strongly influenced by Langhammer. And Third was very strongly influenced by Kokoschka. And Rudy von Leiden, the critic, took Ara under his wing. And clearly you see he mentors Ara. but I don't know if they collected antiquities really. I know Schlesinger for sure did. Classical Indian art.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here today. And thank you, Zahra, Suzanne. Thank you, Dadiba. And thank you all who all have joined us today for this amazing discussion. And I hope to carry on whatever we discussed today. And Zahra and Susan, Dadiba, we can continue these discussions. And thank you all.
I'd like to thank all of you all. Thank you, Dr. Susan Bean. Thank you, Zahra Jumaboy. Thank you, Shalini Pasi. And most of all, I'd like to thank someone who's behind the scene, who set all this up for us and, planned a lot of it, one of my colleagues, Malika. So I'd like to say a big thank you to her as well, and rest of us. Everyone's been pretty intense and involved in this. Thank you all.
It's been great fun, and thank you all for doing this together today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye.